What is going on, gunfighters? Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting, tactics, firearms, hunting, the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. I am your host, Michael Milito. First and foremost, I am a Christian. I'm going to give you a quick abbreviated bio today. Marine Corps combat veteran, also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Law enforcement, LAPD, worked regular and specialized assignments, private contractor. I've been a professional big game hunter and guide and hunted all over. Been blessed to take animals all over this beautiful country. State rifle and pistol champion a few times over in a few different states. That's probably enough for the bio. Let's get into today's topic. What are we going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life? We're going to talk about bear defense and hunting handguns. Now, I've taken a few bear, only black bear. I have lived in grizzly country. I'm in grizzly country right now. However, I've never hunted a grizzly bear or a coastal brown bear, but I have taken black bear, and I have had a few close encounters with a black bear as far as like more specialized training and experience. As far as today's episode goes, I have had bears come into my camp on more than one occasion. I have had a bear come at me, and I have had a separate occasion where a bear was snapping its jaws at me, a mother bear with cubs, or at least with a cub. And I've hunted bear pretty successfully. I took my first bear with a bow, I believe when I was 16. I may have been 15, I may have been 17, but 16 stands out in my mind when I took my first bear with a bow. That being said, let's talk about bear defense handguns. I'm going to start out with the .44 Magnum. I think the .44 Magnum is probably the most powerful of the common handgun calibers for this. I'll talk about some of the other ones less common, but we'll start out with the .44 Mag. The .44 Mag is an impressive round. It is certainly capable for bear defense of any bear on the planet. Now, I want to try and be pretty fair and consistent, so I'm going to try and look up the load data on Wikipedia. You can double check all this numbers and the math and everything for yourself if you want, but I'm going to try and keep it as apples to apples as I can and compare loads from Wikipedia. I do enjoy hand loading, and with hand loading you can really do a lot, but to give you a rough idea of the numbers, for a base of comparison, let's talk about a heavy for caliber 9mm load to start. Heavy for caliber 9mm load is 147 with that's the heaviest common bullet weight. And you're talking subsonic, generally talking right around in the 900-ish feet per second range. And again, loads vary depending on barrel length and even air temperature. But let's say, for good round numbers, 147 and 950. We go back to the .44 Mag. We look at a pretty pedestrian load, I would consider. A pretty run-of-the-mill, nothing spicy. A 240 grain at 1,180. That's a pretty pedestrian load for the .44 Mag. I'm also looking here at a 300 grain load at 1250. 300 at 1250. 300 grain bullet at 1250. That's more velocity and more than double the bullet weight. It is a beast of a cartridge. It has probably taken every big game animal in North America. It has certainly probably taken many a bear. .44 Mag is an awesome cartridge. As you might know, .44 Magnum is a revolver cartridge. It has a rim. I'm not going to discuss the .44 Mag Desert Eagle because it's so big as to be comical. You're probably not carrying that. But .44 Mag is absolutely a great caliber for this. And probably, I'm going to say round for round, the best common defensive caliber for bear. It's got a sufficient size slug moving at a sufficient velocity. Now, be diligent because bullet selection and bullet construction in this is just as important as the caliber. I would say probably more important. I would take a smaller caliber with proper bullet construction than a beefier caliber with less than optimal bullet construction. The bullets you want for this job are far different than the bullets you're going to want for personal protection against people normally. But for this, I'm going to recommend a hard cast semi-wad cutter or a semi-jacketed soft point, not hollow point, unless it's specifically designed for deep penetration on this kind of target. But I think often forgotten in the new tactical world is hard cast semi-wad cutters. They are a phenomenal choice, especially for this. Also, again, the semi-jacketed soft point are also a pretty solid choice for this as well. So on this, a brief aside, a little bit less common, and you might argue even better than this, is the 454 Casull. And I'm not getting into the history of all these rounds. I've probably done entire episodes on just these rounds alone. So if you're like, that round, that's the one I want, go to whatever you're listening to this on, Spotify, to the Gunfighter Life podcast, and type in the name of the cartridge, and probably an episode will pop up just on that cartridge. But the 454 Casull is even more impressive than the 44 Magnum. It is a lengthened 45 long Colt. Now with hand loading, you could absolutely get decent 45 long Colt rounds that I think would be sufficient for this, because you can load them just as hot as a 44 Magnum. But in general, the 45 long Colt is going to be loaded to lower velocities because of the old Colt single action armies that it was originally chambered in. However, getting back to the 454 Casull, this is a modern cartridge loaded very hot. It is a spicy cartridge. Now, if we talk about that same 300 grain bullet we just discussed in the 44 Magnum, you're looking at 1650 feet a second. That's cooking. You can also go up to a 400 grain bullet at 1400. That's a lot of velocity. That's a lot of mass, 400 grains. That's a big bullet. That's a lot of mass. Certainly will do the job. It's much less common than 44 Magnum. I am not really going to discuss the 460 or the 500 Smith & Wesson. I think they're a great handgun hunting round for if you're going to hunt large game. However, they're generally in comically large revolvers. So they're not exactly going to be something I would consider likely that you're going to want to carry all the time as a defensive bear option. You know, if you've ever handled a 500 Smith & Wesson, that's a beast of a revolver. And I know they make the short-barreled ones, but I think even those are a pretty big gun and much larger than a standard, which is already big, 44 Magnum. So the 454 Casull, another good option for that. Now, if we are talking about, we're talking about revolver cartridges right now. There is one I don't think gets a lot of love, and that's a 357 Magnum. The 357 Magnum absolutely has taken many bear, and especially if you're talking about black bear, because let's be honest, the vast majority of people listening to this in the United States live east of the Mississippi, and black bear is the only bear they're ever really going to have to worry about. 357, I think, is absolutely sufficient for black bear. And if we look at a beefy load in 357 Magnum, you're talking the 180 grain. That's about the heaviest you can get. You might decide you just want 158 grain hard cast or 158 grain semi-jacketed soft point, but you can get up to 180 grain. And that's going to give you quite a lot of sectional density and a pretty beefy bullet. If we consider a heavy for caliber 9mm is 147, you're talking 180. So that's pretty beefy. And you're looking at 180 grain at 1400 feet a second. And again, that is no slouch when it comes to handgun performance. That's a decent load. It's not 454 Casull, it's not even 44 Magnum. But for many things, it's absolutely sufficient. And if you want a sleeker, more svelte revolver, it's almost certainly going to be more carryable and manageable in 357 Magnum. Also, 357 Magnum, I think, in my opinion, is the best dual-purpose revolver cartridge for both defensive use. I mean, police officers use that round for a long time. Both the 38 Special that came before it, which is quite a bit less powerful, and the 357 Magnum. And it's a good hunting caliber for medium size and down game. It's a good dual-purpose round, perhaps the best dual-purpose, I'm going to say the best dual-purpose revolver round. Because, 44 mag is also common, but the revolvers are much larger. If we're talking, before we move on to semi-autos, there are a slew of revolvers in 357 that are good options. You can get very light ones made of scandium. Smith & Wesson makes a lot of revolvers. Obviously, the Colt Python is a classic. If we're talking the beefier revolvers, we're talking the 44 Magnums. If you're talking about purely carrying it for bear defense, a really cool option is the Smith & Wesson 329 PD. And in fact, if I could pick any of them in 44 Magnum, I would probably pick this one. Now, I have a scandium frame 357, and it's honestly painful to shoot in 357. However, I'd still probably go with the super lightweight scandium in 44 Magnum, knowing it was probably going to be painful to shoot. This is not a gun that I plan on going and shooting an I-Corps match with, or, revolver division in USPSA. This is one that I'm carrying primarily for defense. And I can dry fire with it a bunch. That's not painful. And I can make sure it's zeroed with the loads I'm going to carry and shoot it sparingly. But the Smith & Wesson 329 is scandium frame, super lightweight 44 mag. So if you're talking about a very carryable defensive 44 mag, that's pretty intriguing. Also, a classic and very good are both the Ruger Red Hawk and Super Red Hawk. The Red Hawk is a little bit lighter and handier, I think, and in my opinion, a better looking gun. It goes up to 44 Magnum. If you want, you can also get a 44 Magnum Super Red Hawk, or in the Super Red Hawk, you can get a 454 Casull, talking about that cartridge. And there are other options. Taurus also makes revolvers chambered in some of these cartridges, and I think their quality control has gotten better in recent years. I don't know that I would choose one. I don't know that I wouldn't. If I did, I would certainly run it through its paces and make sure that it worked well. Now, what if you don't want a revolver for bear defense? What if you want a semi-auto? Many shooters coming up recently in the last, I would say, the gun culture 2.0 in America, nothing against them, but they grew up primarily and came into the gun world in a world of AR-15 black rifles and plastic fantastic, Glock 19 era. They may have never picked up and shot a revolver. It might be as foreign to them as me looking at Cyrillic writing, in a notebook. So maybe they don't have no interest in a revolver. There's really one cartridge that stands out for acceptable for this task. 10 millimeter. Now, we started out with the 44 Magnum. I don't think there's any doubt, unless you cherry pick data, that the 10 millimeter is quite a bit less powerful than 44 Magnum. It just is. It's less powerful. That means round for round, it's going to be less effective. However, if everything else is equal, bullet construction, all that stuff, right? Premium bullet selection in both. I said that's more important a lot of times than caliber, but if we're being fair and consistent, 44 mag is more powerful round for round and should be more effective. 10 millimeter, though, gives you a lot more capacity in most handguns. Now, again, especially on 10 millimeter, because this is kind of the dual purpose caliber used for defense and also could be used for bear protection and hunting. So there's a lot of different loads. A lot of 10 millimeter loads, well, a lot of those are just going to be practice loads, loaded not much hotter than 40 Smith & Wesson, and a lot of the remaining loads are going to be personal protection from people loads. And that bullet construction is far different from what you want for bear defense. You want deep penetration, so be judicious on your selection of bullets. You're going to want something that's designed for deep penetration. Usually something like a semi-jacketed soft point or even a solid. You might want to look at those for this application, not your, rapid expansion hollow point that you're going to want on a two-legged predator for this. Another reason you might choose a semi-auto, although people often are concerned about bears, there is a lot of crime afoot in national parks, national forests. A lot of crimes against people, crimes against property occurring in these remote locations. Criminals take advantage of that no service, no witnesses kind of environment. There's a whole podcast. I've listened to it once or twice with the wife. I'm not really into true crime. I got enough actual crime when I was a police officer. I don't really like it. But there's a whole podcast called Park Predators. There's many, many, many of those about people behaving badly in national forests, national parks, in the backcountry. So don't think just because you're in bear country that people stop behaving badly. If you're talking about a dual purpose for people behaving badly and maybe you run into a bear, but I would submit in almost any environment shy of like an uninhabited Aleutian Island in Alaska, people behaving badly are as much or more of a threat than bears. So for that application, 10 millimeter. But make sure proper ammo selection. You really got to be judicious about this. And you also have to be judicious about load selection in 10 millimeter. Don't just assume because it's 10 millimeter, it's a hot load. Again, some of those loads are pretty pedestrian in the neighborhood of 40 Smith & Wesson. So don't assume just because it says 10 millimeter on the box that it's a powerhouse. Some of those are loaded to actual, what I would consider actual legit 10 millimeter standards and pressure, and some of them are loaded way down. The vast majority of people I think that shoot 10 millimeter just have one and go and shoot it at the range or whatever. That's fine, but that's not what you're looking for. I would say 10 millimeter is not as powerful as a lot of the calibers we just talked about. So really make sure if you're getting a 10 millimeter, it's loaded to its full potential in your 10 millimeter handgun. Now, talking about the 10 millimeter, some numbers, and I know you can get loads hotter than this, but I said I wanted to keep it apples to apples. As far as Wikipedia goes, the heaviest load they list on there is 180 grain at 1,300 feet a second. That should ring a bell because we just talked about that 180 grain 357 Magnum load at 1,400 feet a second. So it's a little bit different because the sectional density is going to be higher, and I would submit better on the 357 Magnum, but right around that ballpark. And I think that's a fairly fair comparison, and I know if you go with the hottest loads, you can get hotter than that. But 180 grain is a real common loading in the 10 millimeter, and it listed it on Wikipedia at 1,300 feet a second. I know you can get hotter than that, but I wanted to keep it a fair comparison. I'm sure I could find maybe hotter load data for many of these cartridges, but that's a 10 millimeter. If we compare that back to the standard pistol round, the 9 millimeter, which I think is the de facto standard today, if you look at heavy for caliber for that, you're looking at a 147 at 980. So 180 at 1,300 is nothing to sneeze at. Now, here's my caution here on the 10 millimeter. Just because it is a semi-auto and it's similar in function to what you're used to, don't assume it's going to be completely congruent with the training and experience you have with a handgun. If you look at what's one of the most common handguns in America, the Glock, if you look at what I'm going to call the standard frame Glock, standard full size, Glock 17, right? You look at the grip size of that, the width of that gun, and then you go look at a standard Glock 20, which is a 10 millimeter version. It is not a little bit bigger. It is in a whole different ballpark. It is like that gun got pregnant. It is a huge, fat beast of a gun. So your grip, all those other things may not translate. If you have average size hands, you may have a really hard time shooting well a 10 millimeter in those common double stack guns. So again, don't just assume because you're used to a Glock 19 that the compact 10mm Glock is going to be just easy to just pick up and shoot. It's a totally different frame. It's a way bigger gun. And in fact, when I was a cop, I was, for a time, before I really knew how to shoot, I thought I knew how to shoot because I was a cop, and then I went to competition shooting and actually figured out there was a lot I didn't know. But anyway, I started out for a while. I didn't start out. For a while, went to the Glock 21. And when I started shooting more competitively and faster, I realized the Glock 21, which is the same size frame as a 10mm in 45, it was just too big to be shot effectively by me. If you have giant, beast hands, then you may find that you like it even better. But for a lot of people, don't just assume that. So these are big guns if you're talking double stack. Don't get, bamboozled by what's on paper. You look, the Glock is a 10mm and it holds X amount of rounds. It's got a lot of firepower. It may, but if you can't shoot it accurately, if you can't hit with your first, second, third round, does it really matter that it holds 10 or 12 rounds? Does that really matter to you? Probably not. Probably better with a gun with less capacity that you can shoot better. I'm just throwing that out there. On kind of the top 10mm handguns, I would say the Glock is real popular. If you're a Glock person, you don't mind the grip angle and the trigger pull that feels like dragging a piano down a gravel road, then the Glock 10mm certainly will probably go bang when you pull the trigger if that's what you're looking for. There's also the 320 that is in 10mm, and they had the 320 for quite a while in 45 ACP. I assume they use pretty much the same thing except for a 10mm barrel. I don't anticipate a lot of problems with that gun. Also, Smith & Wesson M&P has a 10mm. In my experience, those guns have a little bit slimmer grip. It's still going to be bigger than your standard M&P or than your standard 320, but they're a little bit modular, so especially the 320, you could take a Dremel to it, maybe make it a little bit more shootable. You have those options in 10mm. 10mm has kind of seen a resurgence. Now, if you're a 1911 guy and you like a much better trigger, kind of the classic one, and there are many, but the classic one is the Colt Delta Elite. They still make them. They even make one with a rail. If you're looking for a 1911 and 10mm, I'm going to recommend that one. Colt Delta Elite with a rail. You can get something else if you want, but, that's a good gun. So, I'm going to recommend that one. Colt Delta Elite. And I guess I'm going to conclude this. We'll start winding down, putting up the tray table for descent on this podcast, talking about don't assume you need a different gun. If you shoot a lot and practice a lot and you have a good defensive gun, again, I think the ammo selection and bullet selection is more important than caliber. So maybe consider using the gun that you already have. If you listen regularly to the podcast, you'll know that I am en route right now to northern Idaho, and we'll be staying there a little bit. My wife and I are blessed. We're strangers and pilgrims on the earth. We live as neo-nomads. We travel. After our stint in northern Idaho, we plan on going to Alaska. The plan right now is to go to the southern part, the coastal islands where brown bear population is high. I don't have any plans right now, any specific plans to get a bear defense handgun in one of these calibers. I plan on taking my 357 Magnum with 180 grain hard cast bullets or 180 grain lead polyclad flat nose bullets. Whatever the case is, that's what I plan on carrying. I also would hopefully have bear spray and my primary hunting rifle. So I'm just throwing that out there. If you already have a 357 Magnum, maybe it's a better option for you if you're familiar and you shoot that gun well to get a good bullet selection in that gun. If you're going to go the 9mm route, I would absolutely go heavy for caliber. I would go with a flat truncated cone or flat nose bullet, not a hollow point. I would look for hard cast if you can get it. Caveat, if you're a Glock aficionado, or much less popular, an H&K USP, that hexagonal rifling, I do believe in the Gen 4 and earlier Glocks, Gen 4, Gen 3 and earlier, you are not supposed to shoot unjacketed lead bullets in those. It is a concern, and I think the manual tells you not to do that. So I'm not telling you I've never done it, but I'm telling you you're not supposed to unless they've changed that. But those older polygonal rifle barrels that the older model Glocks, Gen 4, Gen 3s, and before had, you're not supposed to shoot lead bullets out of those, I don't believe. Go back and double check that. But just a safety caveat there. Anyway, if you're going to do 9mm, I recommend heavy for caliber 147s, and I recommend going with a flat pointed or truncated cone bullet, not the common popular and kind of the standard for defensive loads. The Spirit Gold Dot is a fantastic defensive load against people. The Federal Hydroshock, HST, things like that, these are not what you want to be looking for a bear load. In general, you want deep, straight line penetration. Different task and purpose. So keep that in mind if you're going to run a 9mm. Again, 147 grain, heavy for caliber, flat nose or truncated cone style bullet. If you're not shooting at one of the Glocks, maybe look at hard cast lead. And you can extrapolate that into less common today defensive calibers. 40 Smith & Wesson. Go with the heavy for caliber bullet. 180 is common, but if you can go heavier, go heavier. Some kind of flat point bullet, which is easy in the 40 Smith & Wesson because it's kind of short and fat anyway. Most of those are going to be a flat bullet, but not necessarily going to your defensive loads. 45 ACP. I do know that 230 grain ball is common. It wouldn't be my first choice for this. I'd look for a little bit heavier, and I would look for a truncated cone, again, hard cast lead, and those do exist. You might want to look for those. I know that in the defensive handgun ammo world for defense against people, expanding hollow point bullets, I totally get that, and I agree with that 100% for defense against people. If you're talking about bear defense, I would always err on the side of penetration. I would always want more straight line penetration until we get up into the calibers we started with, like the 44 mag and the 454 Casull and things like that, big calibers like that. And then you can get a little bit of expansion and still get plenty of penetration. But for the other ones we talked about, I would really err on the side of deep penetration. Tactical tip of the day. I grew up smelting lead, probably at an age far younger than I probably should have been doing it. There was no OSHA in the garage, pouring hot molten lead. I even had my own lead mold for casting round balls for my slingshot, if that gives you any idea of how old. Tactical tip. If you're already into reloading, or you're thinking about getting into reloading, if you're going to shoot any of these bigger calibers, 44 Magnum, 454 Casull, anything other than common rounds like 9mm and things like that, even 10mm can get quite pricey. They're generally a lot more economic in reloading than they are in buying factory ammo, especially something like a 44 mag. You can reload them a lot cheaper, especially if you cast your own projectiles. And again, we talked about hard cast lead bullets. So really think about getting a Lyman or a Lee bullet mold for these and try casting your own lead bullets. It's not that hard. People used to do it for a long time sitting around a campfire. If I remember, the melting temperature for lead is somewhere in the 600 degree range. You can literally do it in a campfire. Melting lead and pouring it into a mold is not that hard. So maybe consider doing that. Also, wheel weights. Now, some of the newer ones I don't think are lead, but many of the old wheel weights are lead. You may be able to get that lead from auto body shops, auto repair shops, tire shops, things like that. I remember my father commonly casting wheel weights. I think wheel weights are already slightly hardened instead of pure lead. So go double check that and test all the lead that you're casting. But that might be a good, affordable way for you to cast bullets and have them be hard cast. Like a hard cast, key style semi-wad cutter. Anyway, that's your tactical tip of the day. Consider melting lead. It's not rocket science. You put the lead in a cast iron pot or container and put it in a fire and let it melt, and you pour it into a mold. And then you generally take the top, it's got a little swing head, and you beat it with a hammer. You drop the projectiles out onto a piece of cloth or something, and you have your lead projectiles. Again, it's not rocket science. Don't be afraid to do that. You probably should use more safety precautions than I did back in the day. Probably get some leather gloves, probably wear some eye protection. Don't get water into your hot melted lead. That's bad. But casting lead is not that big a deal. Tactical verse of the day. Did you know that there's a Bible verse about melting lead? From Ezekiel. As men gather silver, copper, iron, lead, and tin into a furnace and blow fire on it to melt it down, so in my wrath I'll gather you and melt you down. I'll blow on you with the fire of my wrath and melt you down in the furnace. Reminds me of another verse. It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. And another. What's the conclusion of the whole matter? Fear God and keep His commandments. Jesus tells us one thing Jesus says we're supposed to fear. Fear God. Fear the one who can cast us to hell. Don't fear the things that can kill the body and kill the body only. Whether that's a lion, a tiger, a bear, a radical Islamic extremist, something like COVID. You're not supposed to fear those things. Fear and fear God only. The awesome and mighty creator of the universe. Have a respectful reverence and awe of the Almighty God. With that, thanks for listening and have a blessed day.